Good morning. Good to see everybody here. Thanks for joining us for worship today. It was a great baptism we just had in between services. Over a dozen people that took a step of baptism going public, that they had become Christians. And it was really exciting to see that. We had been just in a season where many people have stepped across a line of faith and after they had been sorting. So thanks for joining us. Welcome to those that are outside and on our live stream as well. Today we're going to kick off a new series of messages that is called Worst Case Scenario. And that Roland kind of probably got you curious, like, what are we going to be talking about in this series? And so I don't know if you've ever seen this before, this worst case scenario handbook. I've seen these in the airport and some bookstores, and I hope you never fall out of a Ferris wheel. Hope you never have to escape from quicksand. But as the motto of this book states, if you do, you better be prepared, okay? You better be prepared. And so there is this handbook that has 71 different scenarios, worst case scenarios, things that we hope will never happen to us, fairly unlikely scenarios, like how to break down a door. Here's some of the things you'd find in the table of contents. This is a really interesting reading material, by the way. So how to break down a door. I was reading this a lot last night, a lot early in the morning, like, I probably should know a lot about some of these things in here. We're not actually going to focus on this book, but how to break down a door. What I learned is if you want to break down a door, you don't like kick in the middle of the door. You don't use your hands. You got to kick towards the hardware, right? You got to kick where the bolts are, right? And so I didn't know that, and I thought, that's handy. Let's say you had a reason to break down a door. That should be the only reason you apply that. Or how to hotwire a car. Another thing from the table of contents. How to hotwire a car. Actually, I learned this last year. My truck had been broken into for the second time in a couple of years. My truck is pretty easy to break into, and it's like the day that it happened, I walked out to my car. I saw some stuff on the ground, some sort of like just parts and stuff, and I didn't even think any. I just thought someone got in a wreck outside of I had parked on the street, and I thought, oh, what's this debris? And I didn't even think about it. And then I get into the car, and I realize something's off, and then the dash cover was, the cover over the steering wheel was off, and I'm like, oh, not again. And so they had really destroyed it that time. But as I was putting my car back together, I learned about hot wiring, and I learned a lot more about my car and just how to turn my car on without the key, and it was fascinating. So now again, don't hot wire a car, and certainly don't tell them we told you to do it. But this book will show you how. Or how to escape from a sinking car. Another thing you find in here. It could happen. I hope it doesn't happen, but you'd want to know. How to fend off a shark. Now, I think this is important because I do head to the ocean a lot, especially in the summer. And what I felt actually a lot of comfort. I was reading this early this morning about the shark section, and I thought, most of where I like to surf are beach breaks. They're not point breaks. And point breaks are actually where more shark attacks are at, I learned, because of the depth of the water at those points. And they're hiding in the shallows, and then they come out and, bite you. So now I'm going to continue to surf at my local beach break spots, okay? But if I do get attacked by a shark, I'll know where to start punching. You punch at the gills, and you punch rapidly. So don't just... you want to continue to do it. I'm telling you this because it could happen. How to win a sword fight. My mother was a fencer in high school. Her high school, how cool is that, had a fencing team. And my mother was a decent fencer. She always tells me about it like as a threat, But, you never know. You never know when this kind of encounter may occur. And so you want to prepare. Here's a few other things from the table of contents. How to maneuver from a moving train and get inside. What I learned is if you happen to find yourself on the top of a moving train, you don't run straight. You go in a zigzag pattern. I don't know why. I didn't take the time to really understand that one. But there's a way in here that tells you how to get in. So how to treat a leg fracture. Some of you already know this. Who knows how to treat a leg fracture? I like to know this. I do like to know that. So How to survive when lost in the desert. We live in the desert, and you could get lost here. So we live on the edge of the desert, pretty much. And so how to avoid being struck by lightning. Most of these 71 scenarios are pretty unlikely, okay? It'll be up here if you're just curious. You can read through any of it before you purchase for yourself. I'm not selling these. I make no profit, just so you know. But in this series and in the coming weeks, we're going to be looking at worst-case scenarios that are much more common. Much more common. In fact, when our own real-life worst-case scenarios start showing up, we actually shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised. And here's what I want to look at. It's at the top of your listening guide. This is sort of our theme verse. And we're actually going to be in 1 Peter through this series. But look at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. There's a theme that you see in the book, or in the letter that Peter wrote to the churches. 1 Peter 4:12, Peter writes, "Dear friends, don't be surprised when the fiery ordeal comes among you to test you as if something unusual were happening to you." Don't be surprised. The root of this word surprise is actually where we get the word strange or stranger. It refers to being caught off guard by something, or there's an unexpected turn of events. Surprise, you weren't expecting that. That's really the idea of this word in the Greek. And the root is actually the same word that the Bible uses for hospitality. Be prepared for hospitality. Sometimes you're having a quiet night, and then, surprise, there's guests at the door, and you're like, I wasn't prepared for them. What are we supposed to? Hi, come on in. But it is sort of a surprise, shocking moment because you had a plan for the night. Peter says, in the Christian life, do not be surprised. Don't be surprised when fiery trials show up knocking on your door, when there's tests, when there's unexpected circumstances that come up. Don't be surprised. Do not let that catch you off guard, because trials and difficulty and pressure comes along often. And it tests us. And so the focus, one of the themes of the letter of 1 Peter is tied to suffering and preparing for these types of surprise moments. In fact, Peter actually begins the same letter right after his greeting. So look at 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter gives a greeting initially, and then verse 6, he writes this. You rejoice in this, even though now for a short time, if necessary, you suffer grief in various trials. You're going through it, he's telling them. Because when Peter's writing this, the Christian church was being persecuted. And so it wasn't popular to be a Christian. It was counterculture, and the Christians were really paying a price to make that decision. So he's saying, but there's this short period of testing. You're suffering grief in various trials. Here's why. So that the proven character of your faith, more valuable than gold, which, though perishable, is refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. God, he doesn't waste the testing moments. He doesn't waste our trials. He's actually using your trials for growth. He's using your difficulties for refining. And he would say it's actually best to prepare ahead of time for them. Don't be surprised when they come. But here's the thing. Peter didn't always feel this way. 1 Peter is written sometime around AD 65, okay? So he arrives at this place later in his life. But if we were to back up 30 years, we'd see Peter didn't always have this perspective about being surprised when trials come. He had a different perspective early on. And so what I want to do this morning to sort of I just want to set up the series that we're in by walking through some of Peter's worst case scenario. I want to back up 30 years before 1 Peter. So this series, as we come in the coming weeks, we're going to be in the book of 1 Peter. But I want to give more context to the person who penned these words. This letter was written by Peter, disciple of Jesus. It was eventually copied and then circulated to all the Christian churches. Again, in around AD 65, AD, after death of 65. This is what the churches had received. And to understand it, we do have to back up. So here's Peter's worst case scenario. 30 years before, in 1 week, all that he had given his life to in the previous 3 years came to a screeching halt and took a strange turn. And that's what worst case scenarios do. Worst case scenarios, they upend what you've been working and planning for. See, all of us have plans. We all have scenarios we're trying to work out. The worst case scenario comes and it upends what we've been working for. It uproots our plans, and we have to make a shift. Now, the root of the word scenario for us is the word scene, right? It's a word taken from the theatrical world. Here's what a scenario is. It's a written outline of a movie, a novel, stage work, giving details of the plot, and individual scenes. Some of you are familiar with this. You maybe grew up in drama and in plays. But we all actually approach our lives with a plot. We all script out the way that we want our lives to work out. We have a scenario we're trying to work out. You call it sort of your fairy tale life. This is what I dream about. And we write out the plot, and we say, here's how my life is going to look. And then our best case scenarios occur when everything works out according to the plan in our mind. These are our best days. These are our best seasons. These are the months that we're like, God, that was so good. It's exactly like I imagined. Best case scenario. Some of you may have had a best case scenario year. Would anybody say this was so far as best case scenario year? Anybody? Okay, we got one over here in the front. We got another person. It worked out. Everything has just been working out according to the plan in our mind. We have a plot we're working through. And you guessed it, worst case scenarios actually occur when nothing works out the way we intend. It's like someone took a red pen to our script and, no, that ain't going to work, that ain't going to work, that ain't going to work. Here's what it's going to look like. And we start walking through this worst case scenario. Now, a great example of this, like I mentioned, is found in Peter's life. Peter's one of Jesus' closest followers, one of his closest friends and followers. And the week of the crucifixion and the resurrection, life drastically changed for Peter. And this week came up as a sudden surprise. And I think this is why Peter's theme in 1 Peter is about, hey, don't be surprised when trials come upon you. Trials are for some purpose. The reason he got there is because he walked through this in his own life. Peter became aware in Jesus' final week of two very different scenarios. And most of us are pretty easily able to identify with Peter and his story. As you get to know him, you think, wow, I'm kind of like that guy. He reminds me of myself. Now, here's Peter's first scenario. It's the faith scenario. It's the faith scenario. Peter was introduced to this scenario, and it was just reinforced over and over and over in Jesus' final week and final days. There was an unseen script that was actually calling out the details of Peter's of that week that Peter was experiencing. Peter had worked out everything. The script was already written for how Jesus' week should have looked. Everything was coming to a head in Jesus' ministry, and in his mind, Jesus was going to win. Peter had basically firsthand observed as an eyewitness for nearly 3 years that Jesus was just like on top of the world. He had a growing movement. He had a growing crowd of fans and followers. And Peter got to just witness this right in the front line. Peter personally observed as he interacted with Jesus and did ministry and was allowed to follow him closely. Peter got to see that there was no obstacle that could stop Jesus. There was no barrier that stood in Jesus' way. And there was no challenge too great for Jesus to overcome. And so we come to this final week, and they're heading towards Jerusalem. Jesus is entering Jerusalem, and when he arrives into Jerusalem, Peter's thinking, here he is, and here we are. Jesus is claiming his kingdom. He's here to free. He's here to liberate. He's arriving to put an end to this Roman occupation. And then in this perplexing turn of events, Jesus is captured. He's arrested, he's beaten, he's mocked, he's flogged. And at the end of the trial, he's crucified. And Peter's watching all of this occur to the one that just saw barriers being mowed down before him. Even when the opposition of the demonic would come up against Jesus, there was no match for Jesus. And so Peter is watching this occur, and Jesus doesn't fight. He doesn't resist. He doesn't even act like a victim, which was unexpected because Jesus seemed to be in charge from the start. I want you to look at where Peter and Jesus, where did Peter's calling and occur? When did he choose to begin to follow Jesus? Where did that all begin? Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. It says, as the crowd was pressing in on Jesus to hear God's word, he was standing by Lake Gennesaret, and he saw two boats at the edge of the lake. The fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. Jesus, he got into one of the boats, which belonged to Simon. Now, this is kind of interesting. I always try to imagine, how'd that go down? He just gets into this other person's boat, and he asked him to put it out a little from the land. Then he sat down. Peter allows it. Go ahead. He pushes the boat out. Jesus is about to use the boat as a stage. He was teaching the crowds from the boat, and when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, this is Peter, Simon Peter, he's going to be identified a few verses later. Jesus tells him, put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch. Now, look at the next verse. Master, Simon replied, we've worked hard all night, and we have caught nothing. We've been fishing all night long. We haven't had a bite. We've not caught anything. And Jesus is saying, look, trust me. I know you can't see it. I know you don't think there's fish out there biting, but let's do it again. Let's go fishing. Verse 6. When they did this, and Peter replies before, verse 5, if you say so, I'll let down the nets. When they did this, they caught a great number of fish, and their nets began to tear. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and to help them. They came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. Fishing in those days wasn't like, with just a single pole. This is net fishing. These are net fishermen. They're working together as a team to bring in this, to haul in this huge load of fish. So many fish that the boat began to sink. Try to imagine that after a night of not even really any activity out there. When Simon Peter saw this, he just falls down at Jesus' feet, his knees, and he said, go away from me, Lord, because I'm a sinful man, Lord. And at this point, I just imagine Peter's like, he's backing up, and he's just like, I'm a sinful man. I'm way down here. You're way up here. You're the master. You're the highly exalted one. Verse 9. For he and all those who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so were James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were Simon's partners. All these fishermen cannot believe what has just occurred. Don't be afraid, Jesus told Simon. From now on, you will be catching people. You're going to fish for men. You're going to be used to rescue people. You're going to be a fisher of men. Follow me. And it says in verse 11, then they brought the boats to land. They left everything, and they followed Jesus. This was a huge turn of events where they began to follow him as disciples. And from then on, Peter doesn't leave his side for nearly 3 years. He does not leave the side of his master, his Lord. And most of what we read about, Jesus' miracles, Jesus' teachings, the healings, Peter had like a front row seat. He had the best seats to be able to observe all that was happening, to be able to verify later, it really happened, it really happened. You won't believe it, but there was this one moment where Jesus did this, and then he did that. I mean, he was right on the edge of the action, but there were even points where Jesus said, actually, here, come on the field. I want you to do part of this ministry. And so Peter was also an sort of an activated disciple of Jesus. And so at this point, if you think about 3 years of doing ministry, I was trying to imagine like people you might spend 3 years with closely. And my mind just kept going to like classmates, people that you go through high school with, or you go through college with, or maybe you work with for a season. And that type of frequent interaction, like dormitory life, or playing on like a team where you travel together and you're just playing and you're doing everything together. This was more than that. I mean, this was just time with each other, in and out of different villages, and just city after city after city. Jesus is clearly communicating and living out that he is in charge. He's the one who's in control. And so you come to this point where they enter Jerusalem, and in Peter's mind, what could go wrong? Like, we're about to take over the world. Jesus is about to claim this city and this empire. So here we are at the final week leading up to the cross and Easter Sunday, and Jesus actually turns to Peter at a certain point, and he entrusts to Peter to prepare for his final meal. And he's starting to make some strange signals about his life. And he tells Peter to make preparations for this final dinner. This is called the Last Supper. And he says, there's going to be this transportation and this meal location. I want you to, here's the details you need to know. And Peter goes and gets everything ready, just as Jesus had declared. And it was all like choreographed in detail. Jesus had a plan. He hands it to Peter, and just as Jesus declared it, it starts happening. During the meal they're having together, Jesus identifies at this Last Supper that there is a traitor. There's a betrayer with them. There's someone in their midst who is going to turn on him. And Jesus doesn't do anything about it, but he signals that there's one among them that would betray him. And the disciples are saying, "It's not me, is it?" And they're having this conversation about who is it. Then Jesus turns to Peter and told him, "Peter, you're actually going to deny me 3 times." And Peter couldn't believe it. After this supper together, Jesus leads his disciples out of this room, and they head into a garden for prayer through the night. And they're praying through the night, and eventually they're interrupted by a mob with clubs, soldiers, religious leaders, and the betrayer, Judas, who now emerges to actually betray Jesus. And I want you to look at this interaction. Jesus actually addresses Judas in this way. Matthew chapter 26, verse 50. He addresses Judas, who is one of his 12 disciples. "Friend," Jesus asked him, "why have you come?" Then they came up, took hold of Jesus, and arrested him. At that moment, one of those with Jesus, this is actually identified in a different gospel as Peter. At that moment, one of those with Jesus reached out his hand and drew his sword. He struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. Verse 52. Then Jesus told him to Peter, "Put your sword back in its place, because all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Don't you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will provide me here and now with more than 12 legions of angels?" You see, again, Peter had a script in his mind, and he had a role to play. And if anybody was going to try to stop Jesus, Peter's role in his mind was, "I'll be your defender." And so Peter sees this crowd ready to take Jesus and Judas betraying him, and he's like, not on my watch. Some of you might think, yeah, that's the kind of person I am. I would step into action and defend. So Peter goes into action. He springs and he decides to cut a guy's ear off. I don't know why he started there. And I don't know how you heal an ear. It's not in this book. Jesus takes care of it, actually. You can read that, what Jesus does. But he steps in. Peter's like, "I got this." And he takes the pen. He starts writing the plan. And Jesus says, "It's not going to go that direction. This scenario is going to look really different." He says, "Put your sword away." And Jesus tells him, "Look, if I needed protection, then I could ask the Father to send help right now." And he says 12 angels, 12 legions of angels could come in a moment. A Roman legion is 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. So when you do the math of 6,000 times 12, Jesus is saying, "Look, I have the ultimate secret service. I got plenty of backup here. And in a moment, I could ask the Father, and he would send me 72,000 angels to defend us if needed, to defend me. They could step in, but he doesn't. Put your sword away, Peter." So again, I'm bringing this up because in our lives, we think it's going to go a certain way. We plan it out. We have a scenario, and then it shifts. And Peter saw the scene playing out differently. And Jesus corrects Peter's actions. Another person who was surprised is Pilate. Look at Pilate, John 19. Pilate is this Roman governor. John 19, verses 9 through 12. He never interacted with a prisoner quite like Jesus. Jesus has been arrested. He is on trial. Look at John 19, verse 9. He went back into the headquarters, this Roman governor, and he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus didn't give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" Verse 11, "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given you from above." It says, "This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." And then verse 12, the beginning, "From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him." It's like, oh. There's this sense of, I'm in over my head here. Let's let this one go. But not long after this, as you read, Jesus willingly went through the beatings, full trial, sentenced to die by execution. And he goes to the cross willingly. He lays down his life. It wasn't taken from him. He says, "I lay it down." Now consider this. All of these people in the story, all of these people were running their own scenarios. But there was a larger one at work. There was God's scenario. God was working something else out. God had a plan. Now back to Peter. One more surprise for Peter. Jesus dies. He's buried. And then he's resurrected because he's God. He conquers the grave. He conquers death. And after Jesus' resurrection, Jesus began appearing. We looked at this in the last series. And just after Easter, he began appearing to people and then to groups of people. And here's one of those instances. John 21, verse 1 through 11. Again, this is more of Peter's backstory. This is how these are the types of things involved in preparing Peter to write 1 Peter later, about 30 years later, and to give us instructions on how to prepare for suffering. So verse 1, "After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias." So here's another appearance. "He revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons, that's James and John, these are all disciples, and two others of his disciples were together." "I'm going fishing," Simon Peter said to them. "We're coming out with you," they told him. So they went out, they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. This feels like a flashback, doesn't it? They caught nothing. After a night of fishing, verse 4, "When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus." "Friends," Jesus called to them. They don't know who this is. "Friends, you don't have any fish, do you?" Jesus pulls the fisherman question. I've done this before. Have you ever asked a fisherman, "Catch anything?" Like anytime I'm at the pier in Huntington Beach or any pier, I love walking by the fishermen. And you catch anything? And I want to see what's in the bucket. I want to see what's in the ice chest. And so Jesus pulls the fisherman question. "Catch anything?" "No," they answered. "Cast the net on the other side, on the right side of the boat," he told them, "and you'll find some." So they did, and they were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish. The disciple, the one Jesus loved, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard, see, they don't even realize who this is, that it was the Lord, he tied his outer clothing around him, for he'd taken it off, and he plunged into the sea, since they were not far from the land, about 100 yards away. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, and when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish lying on it and bread. "Bring some of the fish you've just caught," Jesus told them. And so Peter climbed up and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. John gives us that interesting detail, 153 fish. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Now, this must have been like a deja vu moment for Peter. Long night of fishing, But it's taking him back to the Sea of Galilee. But don't miss the importance of this moment. This is a restorative moment that Jesus would basically create this whole scene all over for Peter once again. Because this comes after Peter denied Jesus 3 times. He's communicating to Peter, I'm not done with you. I'm not finished with you. In a lot of ways, what's happening here is he's just taking him back. He says, we're going to fish. You're going to fish for men. We're not done. Peter, you'd made some mistakes, but I still have a purpose for you. Keep moving forward. Keep fishing. Keep leading. Actually, he gives him some responsibilities right here. John 21, look at verse 17. Jesus tells him, he asked Peter these questions. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? He asked him 3 times. This is the 3rd time. And he's asking him specific type of love. He says, do you love me sacrificially? The first 2 questions he asks Peter, or that Jesus asks Peter when he says, do you love me? He's saying, do you agape love me? Do you love me sacrificially? Agape love is one of the Greek words for love, and it means sacrificial love. It's I do what this person needs out of principle. It's not necessarily what I want to do, but I do what they need. It's an act of love and sacrifice. So Peter says, Jesus asks Peter, do you love me like that? Like sacrificially. And Peter says, Lord, I love you. But he's using a different word. Peter replies and says, I philos love you, which means I love you like a brother. I love you like family. 2nd time Jesus asks him, Peter, do you agape love me? Will you sacrifice for me? Peter says, I philos love you. I brotherly love you. And the 3rd time, this is the 3rd occurrence. Verse 17, he asks him the 3rd time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he at this point, he drops down to meet Peter on his level. Do you philos love me? Love me like a brother? Peter was grieved that he asked him the 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you in that way. And then Peter is told this by Jesus, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. And Jesus, he's meeting Peter on his level. You say, I still want you to have a role. Even with your faults, even with your struggle to love me as deeply, I still want you to fish with me. I still want you to even have responsibility. Peter would become one of the key leaders in the church. Look at verse 18. Truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go. And he said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. And after saying this, he told him, follow me. And here's what's happening here. Jesus is saying, Peter, you had a script and I had a script. Mine won. You had a scenario and I had a scenario. Mine won. And Jesus wasn't questioning Peter's love. He was telling him how to love him back. Feed my sheep. And until that week, Peter thought his love for Jesus would be demonstrated by like a statement like, hey, Peter, fight my enemies. But instead, it's, hey, love and pour into the people that are following me. Peter, you're going to die an awful death. Because this is actually a preview of Peter's death right here. He tells him, you're going to die as a martyr. But death is not the worst case scenario anymore because he has seen Jesus rise from death. That didn't have to be the end. So there's a larger scenario. And here's a point I want to make. In worst case moments, we're forced to make a choice. And it's really to ask this question, is there a larger scenario than mine? Is there a larger scenario that God is working? One of the big questions that you will wrestle with is this faith scenario question. Is there someone greater than me that's in charge? Is there something bigger here going on than just me here and now in my life? When is it that you're most open to the faith scenario? Is it the best case or the worst case? It's the worst case. It's the worst case. And here's the second scenario that Peter faced. It's the sifting scenario. Peter got the faith scenario, and then he encounters the sifting scenario. And if you choose to follow Christ, you've chosen the faith scenario. You've chosen to walk by faith. By choosing the faith scenario, you automatically get the sifting scenario as well. You're going to be sifted in life. If you've chosen to follow Christ, you will walk through sifting. Look at this in Luke 22. Luke 22, verse 31. This is one of Peter's denials, or the prediction of Peter's denial. Jesus tells Peter, Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Lord, he told him, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. I tell you, Peter, he said, the rooster will not crow today until you deny 3 times that you know me. Peter, you're entering a time of sifting. You're going to be sifted. This is a process similar to what you've seen done to wheat. Here's a piece of artwork of sifting. But a wire mesh is constructed that only allows the kernels to pass through. And the purpose is to separate the impurities. That's why you sift wheat. It's to separate out the impurities. But what Jesus is saying when he tells Peter that he's being sifted, it's your faith, Peter, that is going to be sifted right now. Faith will be sifted. So look at it again. Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I prayed for you that your faith may not fail. So faith is often mixed in with impurities and motives, wrong motives. Our faith is just, it's mixed in there with a few other things. Things that we trust. And so how do you separate the impurities? Circumstances. It's circumstances that only faith can get you through. And so God allows us or sets up circumstances for us to be sifted. And the risk in the sifting is that your faith doesn't survive. That's the risk. But Jesus says to Peter, I'm praying that that doesn't happen. And he actually tells Peter, when you've turned back, meaning Jesus actually gives him a preview that you're going to turn away. And in fact, Peter does deny Jesus 3 times while Jesus is arrested and suffering and being whipped and beaten and questioned. Peter he goes the other direction, and he starts denying that he knows Christ out of fear. He denies Christ 3 times, and as the rooster crows a 3rd time, just as Jesus said, I think he's overcome with grief and remorse and regret. But eventually he comes back. But the strange thing in this is that Jesus says that Satan would be involved in this scenario. And it makes us wonder, why would God involve Satan? Why would he even allow this? It's because the wire mesh is constructed of the same material that Satan uses. He's actually the author of worst case. And what he does in the worst case moments is he intensifies the unexpected moments that we encounter. So why would Satan help God in this sifting process? Satan's purpose is he hopes that our faith would fail. That's what Satan wants to see happen. He wants to see the circumstances come and sort of blow us over and see our faith fail. That the devastation that we're going through, the surprise trials that come, would just turn our hearts against God. That's what Satan aims to do. But God, he takes the risk because our faith is the most precious of all commodities. He wants you and me to have refined faith. And so he allows us to walk through the sifting. Look back at 1 Peter 1. This is one of the verses we started with, and we'll get into 1 Peter as a letter next week. But Peter writes this. He writes, you rejoice in this, even though now, for a short time, if necessary, you suffer grief in various trials. Here's why. It's so that the proven character of your faith, more valuable than gold, which though perishable, it's refined by fire. God wants to refine our faith as we get sifted, as we pass through whatever he asks us to walk through in our lives. I don't know what your worst case scenarios are as you imagine. I hope this never happens to me. Hope that never happens to me. One of the things I didn't want to happen to me was I didn't want to ever lose one of my kids. But it happened one time. I found him, don't worry. But we were at Disneyland, for a moment, we took our eyes off our middle son, and he was gone. And it was a crowded day at Disneyland, and we were like, went from, hey, where is he? Oh, no. It was one, and it was scary. It was frightening. I'd heard crazy stories about people getting, their kids getting lost, or what if he gets abducted? And so we're frantically looking all over the place, and we couldn't find him. And we were separated from him for what felt like an hour, but it was probably less than 10 minutes. But as a parent, that is frightening. Thankfully, my middle son, he can be loud when he wants to, and he yelled, and he screamed, and an attendant found him and found out he was lost. They took him to City Hall. And Penny Lambert, one of our close friends, her and her husband Scott were with us, and she found him in City Hall, and we reunited with my son. But all I could think of was the worst case, and we fear the worst case. And whenever you're walking through your own worst case scenario, Peter would say this: do not panic. Don't be surprised. We're going to walk through some trials. If you chose the faith scenario, you automatically get the sifting scenario as well. And what we fear most in life is sometimes actually the ground that God calls the holy ground. It's actually where God is refining us. We fear the worst case, but God actually allows us to walk through the worst case scenarios because he wants to refine us to have faith more valuable than gold. So if you want to know how to survive sharks, killer bees, and charging bulls, you should buy this book. But if you really want to know how to handle the fiery trials of life, then come and be a part of the series as we walk through the book of 1 Peter, because Peter took all the lessons he learned in those very, very exciting years of walking with Jesus, and then that final week, and he wrote this letter 30 years later for the church to help them understand how to walk through the sifting that will come. And so here's where we're heading in this series. Next week we're going to look at how to survive a wildfire. We're going to talk about how do I survive when threats, insults, and attacks come my way. Because when that happens to you, it feels like a wildfire. When people are insulting you and attacking you. Whether it's for your faith or maybe you just did something wrong somewhere in life and it's coming at you. Well, that is a sifting moment. And God actually has a lot to say to us through the book of 1 Peter. So come back for that. In a few weeks, we're going to look at how to survive a hostage situation. And we're using some of the titles from the book, but you see some of these patterns emerge in 1 Peter. If you've ever felt like a prisoner to your passions, to temptation, to desires, that's what this can feel like, a hostage situation. Peter writes to the church on how to battle through that, how to survive that. We're also going to look at how to escape from a mountain lion. Because as you learn in the Bible, if you're a Christ follower, if you've chosen the faith scenario, you have a very real aggressive enemy who is seeking and stalking, like a lion, people to chew up and devour and destroy. And so we want to invite you to join us in the coming weeks as we look at really what God is doing in those moments that we all call worst case scenarios. But God is doing something on a much larger scale through them. So I want to invite Cody and our worship team to join me. And here's some next steps. First, memorize 1 Peter 4, verse 12. Don't be surprised when the fiery trials come. That's what Peter writes. Don't be surprised by our worst case scenarios. Second, I would encourage you to begin to read this letter, 1 Peter. It's in the New Testament. If you read it, you'll be a little bit more prepared for the series that we're launching into. Third, I think this will be a really intriguing series of messages for your friends and family who maybe are sorting out their lives right now. And maybe they're going through some really difficult sifting seasons themselves. So I invite you to bring them along as we head into this new series. So let's pray together. God, thanks for being with us all through the worst case moments. All of us have faced just scenarios that have hit us by surprise. And you've helped us, Lord. We can look back in seasons where we've probably buckled under the pressure of trials and let it just run us over, and then seasons where we've endured through them. And I pray, God, that we would be people that would be refined, that our faith would be refined through the many tests that do come. Strengthen each person here right now. All of us, I'm sure, are facing some worst case scenarios. But with your power, Lord, you can help us endure, and you can give us perspective from your word on how to obey you in the midst of the challenges. Help us, Lord, to learn your word so that we know what to do and what to say, and that we know how to walk carefully along the road of obedience in a way that looks different than the way that the world handles pressure and trials. So, Father, help us to endure, Lord, through these seasons. Strengthen us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.